Incoterms 2020 rules, cost and freight CFR updated. After FOB, CFR, cost and freight, is one of the most commonly used trade terms, but it is used without reference to any Incoterms rules in practice. The seller and buyer then have to agree on what they mean by using these three letters in their contract. A brief introduction to cost and freight, CFR. The Incoterms 2020 rules require the seller to place the goods on board the vessel contracted with themselves, as in previous versions. Afterward, the buyer assumes all risk of loss and damage to the goods. On board doesn't mean placing the goods on a ship's rail. In practice, it doesn't matter because it will be defined in the contract according to the nature of the goods. Export and import formalities must be completed by the seller and buyer, respectively. The seller is liable for the carriage cost, as the bill of lading typically states, freight prepaid. Updates to the cost and freight Incoterms 2020 rule. The rule involves two ports. Sellers deliver at ports of loading, but the buyer pays freight to the port of destination, where goods are expected to be received by the carrier. Since carrier is not mentioned anywhere else in this rule, it may have been more appropriate to write receive goods from the vessel. Both parties must agree on who will pay the unloading fee in their contract, the buyer or the seller. CFR is not appropriate for container shipments under Incoterms 2020 because the cargo is transferred to the carrier in a location not physically connected to the port, such as a warehouse or even the seller's premises. CFR isn't suitable for containerized goods. The CFR Incoterms differs from most other Incoterms in that the risk transfer point is different from the cost transfer point. The risk is transferred when goods are loaded at the origin. Only use it for bulk cargo shipping when the seller has direct access to the vessel, rather than dropping the goods in a container at a terminal before loading. This makes CFR Incoterms unsuitable for containerized cargo. CFR seller and buyer obligations, costs, and risks. CFR A1/B1 General Obligations. A1, General Obligations, Seller. According to each rule, the seller must supply the goods and their commercial invoice, as required to prove conformity, as well as any other relevant and specified evidence of conformity, including an analysis certificate or weighbridge document. Every rule also stipulates that documents can be in paper or electronic form unless otherwise stipulated in the contract or whether it is customary. Electronic form is not defined in the rules, so that it could be anything from a PDF file to blockchain or something else in the future. B1, General Obligations, Buyer. According to each rule, the buyer must pay the price agreed to in the contract. The rules do not specify payment as to when it should be made: before shipment, immediately after shipment, 30 days after shipment, half now, half later, or how it is to be paid: prepayment, on presentation of documents to a bank under a letter of credit, or another arrangement. The contract should specify these matters. CFR A2/B2, Delivery. A2, Delivery, Seller. When the goods are delivered, the seller delivers them to the vessel on a specified date, within the agreed period. If no specific period is given, they are delivered normally at the end of the period. The goods are delivered when the seller loads them onto the vessel rather than when the vessel reaches its destination. B2, Delivery, Buyer. Buyers must take delivery of goods not only when the seller delivers them to the ship but also from the carrier at the designated destination port. In other words, delivery occurs when the goods are released from the seller's control, not when they arrive at the destination. CFR A3/B3, Transfer of Risk. A3, Transfer of Risk, Seller. Sellers assume all risks of loss or damage to goods until they have been delivered, under A2 described above. This rule is not applicable to loss or damage in the circumstances described in B3, which varies according to the buyer's role in B2. B3, Transfer of Risk, Buyer. At the point of delivery, all risk of loss and damage to the goods passes to the buyer. In the event the buyer fails to inform the seller of the destination port or the location within that port, then the seller will not be able to deliver under A2, and the buyer will be responsible for loss or damage to the goods after the agreed date, or after the agreed period has come to an end. CFR A4/B4, Carriage. A4, Carriage, Seller. Unless otherwise agreed, the seller must arrange or procure a contract to transport the goods from the agreed point of delivery in Article A2, to the named port of destination or, if agreed, to the designated point, quay or wharf, in the port. It is necessary to carry the goods on usual conditions appropriate to the type of goods, by a vessel normally used to carry the type of goods, using the usual route, often negotiated in the contract of sale, at the seller's expense. B4, Carriage, Buyer. The buyer requires no carriage contract. CFR A5/B5, Insurance. A5, Insurance, Seller. After delivery, there is no risk for the seller, so there is no obligation to arrange an insurance contract. However, at its risk and expense, the seller must supply the buyer with information in the seller's possession, that the buyer needs to arrange its insurance if the buyer requests that information. B5, Insurance, Buyer. The buyer is not obligated to insure the goods, even though they are at risk of loss when delivered. Buyers can choose to insure goods or bear the risk themselves. CFR A6/B6, Delivery/Transport Document. A6, Delivery/Transport Document, Seller. As part of the purchase, the seller must furnish the buyer with the usual transport document, covering transportation to the agreed port of destination. Transport documents must relate to the goods within the agreed shipment period. This document should enable the buyer to claim the goods, from the carrier at the named place of destination, or in a string sale, be able to transfer ownership of the goods to a subsequent buyer by transferring this document. B6, Delivery/Transport Document, Buyer. The buyer must accept the seller's transport document if it is within the terms of their contract. CFR A7/B7, Export/Import Clearance. A7, Export/Import Clearance, Seller. A seller must perform the necessary export clearance formalities at its own expense, including licenses, permits, security clearances for export, pre-shipment inspections, and any other authorities or approvals required by the country of export. It is not the seller's responsibility to arrange for transit/import clearances. Nevertheless, at its own risk, the seller will assist the buyer in obtaining any information and documents necessary to comply with formalities required by the country of transit or import, such as permits and licenses, customs clearance, and pre-shipment inspection, and any other official approvals. B7, Export/Import Clearance, Buyer. A buyer must assist the seller in obtaining any documents or information necessary for all export-related formalities required by the country of export, at the seller's request, risk, and cost. The buyer must complete and pay for all formalities required by any transit country or country of import. This includes all of the permits and licenses required for transit and import, import clearance, security clearance for transit and import, pre-shipment inspection, and other official approvals and authorizations. As they occur after the delivery, the buyer is responsible for them. It might seem strange at first that both the buyer and seller are responsible for inspections before shipment. However, for clarification, the seller is responsible for an export requirement, and the buyer is responsible for any import or transit requirement. CFR A8/B8, Checking, Packaging, Marking. A8, Checking, Packaging, Marking, Seller. As a general rule, the seller bears all costs relating to the delivery of the goods, including any costs associated with checking quality, measuring, weighing, and counting the goods or packaging. Sellers must also package the goods at their own expense, unless unpackaged goods are usually in the goods trade, such as bulk goods. The seller should also consider how the goods will be transported and package them appropriately unless the parties agree in their contract that the goods should be packaged and marked in a particular way. B8, Checking, Packaging, Marking. Buyer. As far as packaging and marking are concerned, the buyer is under no obligation to the seller. Nevertheless, there can be exceptions in practice, such as when the buyer provides the seller with labels or logos. CFR A9/B9, Allocation of Costs. A9, Allocation of Costs, Seller. The seller is responsible for all shipping costs until the goods reach the vessel under A2, but the buyer is responsible for those incurred under B9. The seller must cover any transport-associated security costs, along with the costs associated with loading the goods on board. If the contract of carriage includes transit costs and unloading at the discharge port, then these costs belong to the seller. A bill of lading is usually a proof of delivery that the seller provides, so any document fee incurred is the seller's responsibility. A seller is responsible for any costs, export duties, and taxes, if any, associated with clearing the shipment for export. A seller must pay the buyer for the costs associated with providing information or documents requested by the buyer to assist with their export formalities. B9, Allocation of Costs, Buyer. Buyers are responsible for covering all related costs of the goods, other than those paid by the seller. Buyers must compensate sellers when the seller assists them in obtaining information or documents that are required to obtain insurance, transit, and import clearance. Any duty, tax, or cost associated with transit or import clearance is the buyer's responsibility. The buyer is additionally responsible for any additional costs incurred by failure to provide prior notice, when the parties agree in their contract for the buyer to determine the shipping dates and receiving point of the goods at the port of destination. CFR A10/B10, Notices. A10, Notices, Seller. The seller must notify the buyer that the goods have been delivered, meaning loaded onto the vessel. In addition, the seller must give the buyer any notice the buyer requires to receive the goods. The nature of that notice will be defined in the sales contract, and it could also include clauses contained in the charter party contract of carriage. B10, Notices, Buyer. As part of the contract, the parties may agree that the buyer is entitled to determine the ship-out date for the seller and possibly, more importantly, the delivery point within the named port of destination where it will receive the goods. The buyer must give the seller sufficient notice if that is the case. Usually, the contract will specify how much notice is required. Recap. In international trade contracts, cost and freight specify how the seller of goods must provide the buyer with the documents necessary to collect the goods from the carrier and ensure that they are carried to the port of destination by sea. The seller is not required to obtain insurance for a shipment during transportation when a buyer and seller contract specify cost and freight in their agreement. Thank you for watching, and I hope the information provided in this video gives you a better understanding of the Incoterms rule for CFR. Do drop me your comments and let me know your thoughts. Coming soon, CIF, Cost, Insurance and Freight. To be the first to watch the next video, please subscribe to my channel and click on the notification bell. Goodbye. From your trusted shipping guide. Revisit.